My name is Alex Dukalskis. I direct the center, and I'm also an associate professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at UCD. So we're here to discuss China-Russia relations in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's an important topic because the two powers have been growing closer together since around 2014, and only weeks before the invasion declared their deepened partnership in a joint statement. The partnership involves many shared views, an ideological wariness of democratic systems, a dissatisfaction with the United States, wariness or distaste of NATO, some economic complementarities that are interesting, but there are also some clear limits to that partnership. While China has provided diplomatic and other forms of support for the invasion, it has stopped short very clearly of going all in. To help us sort all of this out, we are very lucky to have Dr. Bērziņa-Čerenkova. She is the head of China Studies, of the China Studies Center and the Political Science PhD program at Riga Strādins University. She is also the head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute for International Affairs. She has held a number of visiting fellowships and posts at a number of prestigious universities around the world, including King's College London, Stanford University, and Fudan University. She's the author of the recent book on this very subject, as a matter of fact, Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia, which I highly recommend. So we're very lucky to have her here to help us explore this relationship in light of the invasion. She's going to plan to speak for maybe 20-25 minutes or so, and afterwards we will have questions and answers. Well, questions for sure, answers remains to be seen. We will put, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box, and I will then give them to Una. So with that, thank you very much for coming, and we'll hand over to Una. Welcome.
Thank you. And I believe after Professor Dukalskis' introduction, there's not very much to add, because that indeed is a very good way how to look at this relation. So stopping short of something that has more commitment and yet growing in strength. So let me start by giving a quick there's so many names for this partnership, and there's the pro-Russian neutrality Chinese position, right? And then there's the arm's length embrace, which of course grows on. It grows out of our colleagues' use of wary embrace. So indeed, where do these two countries stand? And today I want us to try at least to attempt to gauge the perception of Russia in the foreign policy establishment thinking of China, and also especially, of course, after the invasion, Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But just looking at official statements is not enough, so we're going to just poke around a little bit also into in the Chinese academic articles pertaining to the subject. So we've heard that the Chinese position has been called ambiguous, balancing, contradictory, or even solidly pro-Russia, actually. And there is no joint there is no consensus among my colleagues. So we have a very well-informed and tight-knit community of China-Russia watchers, and we disagree as to the reality of this relationship. And like I say, it's a very informed discussion. So, but still coming out of the same information that we have, we still disagree on how deep does it run. For example, I have colleagues, including my Polish colleagues, who say that it is a solidly pro-Russia position, even though China is trying to hedge a little bit. At the end of the day, when it counts, it's provides support. Then there's of course the position that no, in fact, China is trying to distance itself from Russia. So wherever you fall on this discussion, it's not my aim today to persuade you of one or another outlook. I just want to provide you with more information, and perhaps also receive information from you for you to be able to understand both sides of this story. So today, quickly, I want to talk about why is it so hard to come up with a definitive answer, because it's a moving target. In fact, this relationship is a moving target. to describe. Then I want to talk a little bit about how does Chinese diplomacy outlook paint Russia, or where does it put Russia? So Xi Jinping's big country diplomacy and the diplomacy outlook for new era, where does Russia fall? Then I want to look at some of the articles that have come out from Chinese academia and think tanks that are trying to, specifically the bits where they describe an ideal Russia and an ideal Russia-China relationship. So kind of what are they thinking? And then I have my first attempt at an orange table. I've come to believe that when you put things on a table and when you draw an Excel sheet, then people suddenly believe you more. Then let's give it a shot, experiment-wise, and let's see what China's interests then are. And then we're going to move on to Q&A. So first of all, how did I even get interested in this topic? After 2019, after this happened, after Russia-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Coordination for a New Era was announced, I started as a China scholar, but as a Russian speaker, I started getting a lot of requests from my colleagues and just and also from academic institutions and from the media to explain, what does this even mean? Is this new? Is this same but different? And that led me to kind of try to look into this relationship from both sides, using both languages, and to write my book. But my central question, of course, was how close are Russia and China really getting? And it was really hard to answer. And I realized the more I knew, the harder it was to answer. And then after February 24, which brings us to the topic of today's talk, an additional level of complexity was added to this question. How close are Russia and China getting? And has Russia's attack on Ukraine changed this calculation in any way? I do have to say I'm looking at strategic narratives. I'm looking at economy, less so because I'm not a trained economist. But I have to say what I found extremely fascinating is the role of the military cooperation. And I think that's kind of a red thread that runs through this relationship. And I think that's where we mostly debate with my colleagues on how important this is and how much of a just posturing this is and how deep does it really go. So because I think military cooperation is an extremely interesting case study because of course, there's so little information available. We only get nuggets of releases that are being brought our way. So we're mostly biased towards receiving information that is put out there for the reasons of posturing at the end of the day. Second of all, of course, it is it's an entangling form of cooperation. It's really hard to do. There's some level of ad hoc you can do, but at the end of the day, it does require a certain level of trust to be able to cooperate militarily, and that paints a certain picture of entente between Russia and China. So how far does that really go? But then, if you want to really gauge, so on one hand, you have a lot of reports, especially after the invasion and in the recent months, that kind of point towards military cooperation and increasing military cooperation between Russia and China. So you got the joint naval drills. I'm just talking about the most recent ones, right? This is October and just now December. I'm not even mentioning the famous flyovers, right? When Pelosi's visit to the region concluded. So this is just the latest. You got bombers, you got Navy. It looks like, and a lot of these are firsts. On the other hand, you also have reports and information showing that, in fact, it's somehow a lot of these reports are coming out from Russia, stating the deep level of this understanding, whereas China is really kind of playing a double game, right? So, for example, this is via the first screenshot is via a colleague of mine who posted it. I do not have access currently to Russian media because I'm in the Baltics. I'm in Riga, and Russian media has been blocked here. And I rely on the kindness of my colleagues to send me screenshots of the Russian media. But so this is one thing that's also quite fresh, right? Another thing that I think is worth also mentioning is, for example, which paints a very good picture of how Russia and China signal the depth of commitment differently, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. and what preceded it. So when Putin spoke, first of all, it was Putin who made the announcement that he's going to meet Xi Jinping. And he made it look like, and the Russian side presented it almost like a bilateral meeting of, two extremely close partners, and which is at the core of this whole event. And then around it, like kind of the outer layers of the cake, you got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which is kind of just a backdrop for these two men to meet. China approached this messaging completely differently. First of all, when they spoke, the first visit was not, of course, to Moscow, and it was not about meeting Putin. Before heading to Samarkand for the summit, Xi Jinping visited Kazakhstan. He met with Tokayev, and he actually spoke about sovereignty. So he went to a country that, in fact, has disobeyed Russia and has shown that it is not happy with how Russia has attacked another sovereign state, and has refused to expel the Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, even though Russia really asked and kind of said that you have to expel this ambassador. Kazakhstan said no way. So this is where Xi Jinping goes and talks about how China respects country sovereignty and territorial integrity, and then only then he takes the plane to Samarkand. He meets Putin. So just a very different approach to messaging. So that's why it's a moving target, really, to gauge the relationship of these two countries. And if that's not complicated enough, we got other players coming in. We got, for example, just now, Charles Michel went to Beijing and, as Politico stated, left his DNA there. And he speaks, and again, it's his remarks are fascinating, because we would have thought that the idea of asking China to be a sort of a mediator was dead and buried. It was something we heard in February, March from the EU, and then it kind of felt that all these signals of China's support, whether it's tacit or just right out full support, you would have thought that would have poured some cold water over the idea of asking China to facilitate. And yet here we are. And again, we have Charles Michel saying that he spoke to China about, China as a global player, and both EU, China have an interest in a rules-based order. And basically, I urge President Xi, as we did at our EU-China summit in April, to use his influence on Russia to respect the UN Charter. So that's still on the table. Now let me go to the bit that I outlined, that we want to, first of all, to look at where does Russia then fall in China's foreign policy outlook. So this is an interesting website which outlines Xi Jinping's idea of China's diplomacy in the new era. So, and here you see I wonder if you can see the pointer on the screen. Yeah, okay, excellent. So on this side, you have the categories, and here you have Xi Jinping's quotes pertaining to these categories. So this would be, the four major pillars of Xi Jinping's thought for Chinese diplomacy in the new era are big country diplomacy. So the story of all countries matter, no matter big or small, is in the past, along with Hu Jintao's legacy. So we have big country diplomacy as the first. And along the big country diplomacy, you have three subcategories. The first is China-America, China-US relations. Then you have China-Russia relations. And then you have China-Europe relations, which is interesting, right? Because it's not a country, but here you go. Then the second big pillar would be the regional relations, the vicinity. So the countries that are China's region. Then you would have the developing countries, how it's called in Chinese. So basically, the countries, so the relationship with the developing countries. And then you have multilateral foreign relations. And of course, so what is interesting is that upon examination, you see that Russia is unique here because it falls under all of these pillars. So it falls under the big country diplomacy. It is a regional partner for China. It is a member of multiple China-led and and where China is a part of multilateral platforms, including the just mentioned Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but not just that. And according to the Chinese official outlooks, Russia is a developing country. So all of these intersect when it comes to Russia. So we should not, of course, downplay the role of Russia in Chinese foreign policy thinking. Now let's look at what the academics are writing about this relationship then. If it is so important, you would think that perhaps China would want to demonstrate more support towards such an important country. But that's not what we're really seeing. We are in fact seeing that an ideal Russia for China is actually a contained Russia in a sense. And for example, let's look at Hu Zinan from Tongji University. So he writes for Asia Pacific Economic Review. And basically, this is not about supporting your partner. This is about economic opportunities for China in the quote unquote Russia-Ukraine conflict. So basically, he argues strategic ambiguity on Russia, deepening China-EU economic trade cooperation, and then looking at how the situation can be used to China's advantage. Then the second example I'd like to give you is, for example, here you see that this underscores the differences in perception. So often enough, we're talking about how basically because Russia is so important to the Chinese, because Russia is so important to the Russian, let me start over. Because Russia is so important to the Chinese diplomatic outlook, then we can somehow assume that their cooperation is deeper than it actually is. And often enough, whenever we're at think-tanking events, we get asked the question of their cooperation in the Arctic. But the truth is that, of course, China is very well aware of the differences, quote unquote, differences in perception between Russia and China when it comes to the Arctic. So it does not really believe that under current circumstance, Russia would just open its door to China in the Arctic. Now, the third quote I want to show you is actually from Shanghai Institute of International Studies, Yang Jiemian. So we're talking about a member of Foreign Policy Advisory Group of Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Again, this is, of course, not policy-making level, but still these narratives and these opinions circulate. So it's really interesting. And what is interesting here is that the author underscores that this Russian invasion of Ukraine has had a detrimental effect on the developing, quote unquote, developing world, and that of what China perceives itself to be a leader. And this is, I think, this text in a very veiled fashion talks about the issues that the Chinese academic community underlines in Russia's invasion. So gains and losses are both expected, but the crisis has posed more challenges than opportunities for developing countries at present. So what we're seeing here is a critique of Russia for destabilizing the quote unquote developing countries. Now, I promised an attempt at an orange table, and on this, and I think it's extremely hard to answer to what extent does China support Russia especially after its invasion in Ukraine, and especially now. I think, by the way, there's a third level of complexity to this question: has Russia's failure so far changed the calculation again? Because it's a very different war, right? It was a situation in February 24, 25 when we were all sitting behind a TV screen looking at Kiev being completely empty and the sirens going off, right? And you kind of, you felt like all is lost. You felt like, oh my God, Russia is going to take over. And it's a very different situation from today. So has that changed China's calculation then in this relationship? But we will discuss more of that during the Q&A. So let me just perhaps divide the considerations of China into two realms, kind of the strategic realm and the economic realm. And we actually see that in both of these realms, we see that there's the ideological, the balancing, and the opportunistic considerations from just looking at the text. So ideologically, of course, China is very interested in showing that the West, specifically the US, is a bad influence on global security. And in that sense, Russia's attack on Ukraine is a wonderful tool that has fallen into China's lap to talk about, NATO expansion as the root cause of European instability and global instability. And now with NATO and US expanding into the Indo-Pacific, creating these new alliances, right? We just heard Lavrov speak about this and talk about how he's going to work with China to counteract that, to counterbalance that almost. So this is bad news for global security. Economically, actually, what we see in those texts is another very interesting motive, is basically to show that Russia's failed because it embraced the Western-style capitalism as a post-socialist society. This has led to this issue. So Russia took the wrong path after the Soviet Union fell apart, and then. In the balancing realm, though, I have to say, then but of course this doesn't, these ideological considerations do not negate the need for balancing on China's part. So strategically, China knows that if the end game is about being dragged into an American-Russian conflict, and plus being bound to the losing side, that's not where you want to put yourself. So of course there's going to be balancing behavior. Economically obvious, sorry for being Captain Obvious here, but of course, avoiding sanctions, avoid being kind of called out as the helper of Russia, and to also be on the receiving end of Western fury here is something China is contemplating very strongly. That's why we do not see direct and overt sanction avoidance behavior to help Russia avoid sanctions on Chinese part. And the third realm would be, I don't even know, Professor Dukalskis knows much better how to conceptualize these things. I'm just a poor China scholar, so I don't know. But it seems like something we could call opportunistic, the realm of opportunism, so which is kind of on the other side of the spectrum to strategic thinking. It's about kind of get in a room and see what you can get. And here, actually, what comes out in these texts very clearly, and also in some quotes that I provided to you, is that, first of all, China is trying to explore what are the concessions Russia is ready to make, being a bit of a loser here and not having a lot of choice for the PRC military-industrial complex and also for the PRC enterprises. So both the strategic and the economic realm here as well. So this is just an attempt at trying to, and maybe you can critique this, or maybe you can add some things to this. So just a couple of minutes to conclude, I would say that it is a partnership with limits. What we see in the text is that after the invasion into Ukraine, Russia has been consistently exaggerating Chinese commitment to the bilateral relationship. Second of all, we see that Chinese official foreign policy communications draw a line. They present Russia as an ideological counterpart, as almost like the good guy in this, but as one of the counterparts, not the only one. China's not zooming in on an exclusive alliance with Russia. Third of all, I would say that an ideal Russia for China is an entity that is contained enough to continue needing China, but functional enough not to implode, which is very important. And we see that coming out in a lot of texts, that a chaotic, broken Russia is not in China's interest, of course. So I would say that this is just a limited support doctrine in new clothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these remarks. There's obviously a lot to unpack, and we have a little over a half an hour to do so. If you are watching this, can I encourage you to please put questions into the Q&A, and I will then pull those out and ask for response. I have a few questions to get us started, if you don't mind. This is a really excellent talk, and there's so many directions we could go, but I want to ask a few questions to get your view, and maybe this will include some speculation as well, possibly. Right. One is, you talked about the possibility of China playing a mediating role in the conflict. And I wonder, given what you know about China's foreign policy goals and its orientations towards Russia, towards the conflict, towards NATO, to what extent do you think China can be effective in that capacity and an honest broker between the sides in that scenario? The second question is, we've seen some reporting, and it's obviously really hard to substantiate these kinds of things, but some reporting about back channel discussions between China and the United States with regard to China putting pressure on Russia to do certain things. And some have speculated that there's sort of this agreement that China will restrain Russia's potential use of nuclear weapons, and in exchange, the United States won't send certain advanced weapons to Ukraine. I wonder if, again, knowing that it's hard to substantiate these things, and people, as you mentioned in your talk, kind of leak these things for particular reasons often. Would something like that make sense given what you know about the relationship, that those discussions would be happening, and that China would agree to something like that? And the third, if you don't have enough already to respond to, the third would be, what does domestic opinion, public opinion in China look like with regard to the war? Obviously, domestic opinion in any system, but especially a system like China's about foreign policy, is not likely to have much of an effect on decision makers' calculus, but nonetheless, it would be interesting to know what we know, if anything, about public opinion in China with regard to the war. So we have the mediating question, the US question, and then a public opinion question. And then I will look for questions in the Q&A box from attendees. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Yes, three questions is a good number to tackle. So on the first question regarding whether China could be an honest broker, I think that in this, I'm skeptical of this, but of course I see where Michelle is coming from. You have to have a good agenda, and you have to still kind of show that China matters, and that the EU is looking for some sort of exchanges. But of course, China, I would say, has the leverage to push Russia in one or another direction. Another question is whether they would listen, but theoretically the leverage is there. However, China is not interested in doing this because, like I said, the situation with its challenges still has a lot of opportunities and has a lot of good things for China there along several realms. So I do not believe that, unless a certain interest appears. So unless it is in China's own interest that it will do this. The second thing is, if you are engaged in such a rhetoric battle with the United States and with them as a security actor and them as a presence in the quote unquote Indo-Pacific, depending on whether you like joining the oceans or not. You don't want, as China, you don't want to suddenly be cast as a pro-Western, leader, as somebody who takes cues from the US or the EU when they tell you to go, facilitate. So no, I don't think so. If China takes part, then it's going to be signaled as a completely, and by the way, China has been formulating this, Chinese foreign policy communicators have been formulating this in a very interesting way. It's called, China has been dealing with the situation in its own way I'm sorry for the snoring sounds. It's my dog. I hope it's not the public that's snoring. It's just a dog. So yes, that's the in its own way, right? So they're leaving themselves a little bit of room here, saying that they're taking part in their own way. But no, I do not believe in what you call an honest broker. Also for institutional reasons and how China is built. Number two, I have it on quite good authority that report, that leak is not, that is faulty. So this back channel talk, I mean, on between the US and China, of course, there's still, I believe there's some channels open. I mean, obviously not on very high levels, but you still have, I mean, of course, we know the mill conversation has been suspended, but at the end of the day, perhaps there are some channels. But this particular leak, I would put my, I would say that we should disregard it, and we should not pay too much attention to this particular report, to be honest. Now, number three, the public opinion. Of course, I don't do research on Chinese public opinion, but I do have excellent colleagues that do, and that come up with, new ways to gauge it. And I want to say that also my colleague Richard Tuchani at SEAS has just a project that he's running and we're a part of, has just also concluded a survey of the public opinion in China, and also in other countries. So it's a global opinion survey, and I encourage you to check it out. But so how, as a qualitative scientist, I'm going to answer to you anecdotally. I'm going to say that, of course, there is a huge anti-US sentiment among the population. We cannot, discount that. There is foreign policy nationalism is a very strong presence in the Chinese public opinion, in kind of pride and this feeling of the US as being a bully and all that. So of course, that stands up to the US. If that's how it's being portrayed, then that is a force you want to get behind. On the other hand, of course, we have seen that the shifts in the debate have appeared when information about atrocities has reached the Chinese public. So it's really hard to argue on behalf of someone who is, bombing theaters with the name where it says children, or even though, of course, there's always the, okay, let's discount this as fake or it's not proven. But yet we see that the emotional bit rings quite strongly with the Chinese populations, due to, of course, the mid-20th century history of China itself.
I see. Thank you. We have some questions from the audience. So let's start with a very good question. What could the United States or the European Union or Europe offer China to drop Russia as an ally in this conflict? What is the price that would kind of make that happen, if anything? Or is this an ideological commitment that any material or political inducements would fail to move?
Thank you, Tariq. So I would say that, of course, there is, if it's a purely transactional approach, then yes, of course, the EU can immediately bring Kai out of, and start talking about Kai again and the sanctions, but we're not going to do this because at the end of the day, like I said, Chinese considerations are not about immediately jumping on this train and helping the situation. So I think we should resist, actually, the transactional thinking in foreign policy here. And of course, we cannot also ignore the long-term challenges that China does present to the EU and that have been outlined many times, and also the US, right? So I think we're not in a position here to offer concessions in hope of China as a mediator. I think that's not an informed foreign policy choice.
Okay, great. We have a question about the Belt and Road. So how does the conflict impact China's approach to the Belt and Road initiative? And maybe for the uninitiated, you could say a little bit about kind of what the Belt and Road is. Will this alter China's foreign trade and economic policy in different ways? You talked about this a little bit in the context of Central Asia, but maybe you might even expand a little bit about how this fits into China's signature foreign policy program over the last 10 years or so.
Thank you, Connor. So Belt and Road was announced by Xi Jinping in 2013 as he was visiting Kazakhstan, and he had a speech in, I think it was at the university, right? And he spoke about this huge connectivity project. And it was still very opaque. We didn't know what that really meant. But what it boils down to is the belt is the 21st century economic belt, and which is kind of a land. It's heavily based in railroad traffic, right? So railroad connections between China and Europe. And then you have the Maritime Silk Road, the 21st century Maritime Silk Road, which is the road bit in the Belt and Road, which also is kind of a connector between different ports and between the oceans, and kind of a sea route, a pan sea route that brings together, again, a shipping. So basically, as China presented this was a connectivity and logistical almost initiative, right? So this was about connectivity. But of course, very quickly, sorry, the dog, but very quickly, this turned into, so the other voices from the West started saying this looks like a geopolitical thing. There's security implications to this. But let me stop lecturing you about Belt and Road and turn to the immediate question. Of course, Ukraine was a very important country for Belt and Road for China. For Ukraine, in a way, is first of all, it had a lot of contacts with China bilaterally. Second of all, China was kind of looking towards Belarus as this inroad into Europe in a lot of ways. But then as the issues with Belarus, especially after 2020, with the presidential quote unquote election, and then China kind of concentrated more towards Ukraine. So of course, a war in Ukraine does not at all help China's interests. Plus, on top of that, of course, when you are signaling as a country that you are a strategic partner of Ukraine, right? That you have such great bilateral relationship, and then a neighbor attacks this country, and you are not really supporting your strategic partner. That says a lot about the value of the strategic partnership. So obviously that did a lot also to decrease the image of China in Ukraine. But I think that another important point on Belt and Road, also, we always ask whether Belt and Road has failed or whether has it prevailed. I would say that the goal of China that was to kind of bring together the West and the rest, or to say that this is an initiative that does not, worry about whether this is the developing world or the rich guys in the West, that has failed. We see very clearly now that this has not gone down well in the West. At the same time, there are very many examples where it has prevailed in the developing world. So Belt and Road is a tricky one. Now, the question is, I don't see the question anymore. I'm so sorry.
The question was, how does the Russia-Ukraine conflict impact calculations for the Belt and Road, basically?
Okay, yes. So basically, Belt and Road in Europe is not moving. It's pretty much dead. And that's how and of course, this war is the last nail in its coffin. And China cannot be too happy about that. So this is an example in how talking too long makes you lose the thread of the question, and I apologize.
No, that was great. That was very informative response. We have a question about the United Nations. So how would you assess China's voting behavior in the UN regarding the invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, UN voting behavior is indeed, it falls into this whole pattern of what I tried to outline in my orange table. So China does, on one hand, abstain or even, support Russia at some cases. In others, it doesn't. So again, this is a particular art to analyze UN behavior, UN voting, and I have colleagues that are interviewing and just also working behind the scenes and have written great stuff on this. But I think China's voting in the UN very nicely falls into the limited support doctrine.
Okay. We have a question about under what conditions would China support Russia militarily, actually, if at all? Would it ever cross that threshold?
It's terribly hard to make an assessment like that, right? And based on the limited information, I mean, if we even knew everything in the world, it would still be hard. But I would say that we are not going to see an overt support in Russia's invasion, because, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of strategic sense if you think about it, right? It's right now, it's not the winning side. You lose more. China would lose more by doing this rather than, it can show, wink, wink, nudge, nudge support under the table for Russia. And Russia would already be kind of thankful because this is more than nothing. So what would be the strategic consideration to go all in and to provide military support? So I wouldn't think that we're going to see this. But of course, when we see pictures of the navies roaming the oceans together, and when we see the strategic bombers roaming the clouds together, that makes you think that China does want to posture that it can, in fact, that it does in fact have an ally in Russia. So it's a very complicated question.
Okay, we have a question about Central Asia. Could you talk a little bit about the competition between Russia and China for influence of Central Asia? Russia is traditionally ascendant there, of course, but it is clear that Russia's war in Ukraine provides an opportunity for China to expand its influence in this large, resource-rich region. So could you expand a little bit on the Central Asia dynamic of all of this?
I certainly agree with the premise that's included in the question, with this that the war changes the calculation in Central Asia, because, of course, talking to my colleagues from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in early March, we were just yelling at each other through a Zoom screen. We're next. No, we're next. No, they're going to come after us next. No, you guys are in NATO. You're good. So obviously, of course, you're absolutely right. The war does provide the opportunity for China to expand the influence. The question is how much what kind of influence is China looking for? If it's development, then that's always been there. China's been a player. I would say that what it does is that Central Asian countries, at least some, right? We're lumping everyone together, but I think we're going to see it in especially with Kazakhstan, are going to use this to are already using this to distance themselves from Russia. And by the way, Mongolia is an interesting example too. We sometimes look at Central Asia, but Mongolia faces some of the similar challenges and dynamics there. So definitely, Russia's invasion, and I've read that somewhere in Russian sources, and I've read that what the Russian analysts have published, that one of the big collaterals of Russia's move on Ukraine is the loss, is the possibility of even more concessions in Central Asia and losing Central Asia. Having said that, of course, we should not underestimate the cultural proximity that Russia has in Central Asia, and the cultural kind of, it's the South. It's so well known. China is the other. My colleagues have interviewed Kazakhs who have conducted interviews in Kazakhstan, and when they've been talking about China and the anti-Chinese sentiment, they have referred to China as have used racial slur to refer to the Chinese, right? Which is ironic because we know that Kazakhs are also very, very different racially and are not necessarily that different from the Chinese. So that shows you the psychological proximity of Russia vis-a-vis China and Central Asia.
Okay, great. So I'll ask one last question and then we'll wrap up. I'd like to. Oh, actually, we have another one. Sorry.
Oh, the Quad.
Two more questions. How does Russia and China view the Quad, the sort of emergent security forum, let's say, between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. So the Quad is 4. Does Russia and China view the Quad as an Asian NATO? Or how does China and Russia view the Quad, I suppose, is the question.
Oh, Quad is one of the points of agreement between China and Russia. And of course, they both view the Quad very negatively. And there's an additional deal sweetener for China, actually, because of course, Russia has been falling back on India to balance out its asymmetry in its relationship with China. So kind of bringing India all the time, mentioning India in its strategic documents also as this very important partner. It's not just China, we also have India, but India is in the Quad. And so for China, shooting at the Quad rhetorically is very beneficial, because this is the one wonderful example where Russia's and India's interests very clearly do not align. And if we think back to, I think it was 2021 or 2020 when Sergei Lavrov, or even before that, 2019, I'm sorry, the years have been flying. It's so hard to remember when that happened. But basically, let's say a couple of years back, Sergei Lavrov was speaking to his Indian counterparts, and he dismissed this whole idea of the Indo-Pacific, and he was very patronizing in his remarks, basically saying that, you know, the Americans are trying to trick you. I'm not quoting directly here, but basically saying that this whole framework works for the Americans and not for you. And the Indians reacted very, very harshly to this, and they did not like being patronized like that. So that also shows that the Quad is very fortunate for China to be able to kind of, although we of course know that India is not a full ally for the US. We know that India has its own foreign policy. But at the end of the day, this is one of these very sweet examples for China. So definitely, and that's what Lavrov's remarks focus on, right? That the US is building a new NATO in the Asia Pacific. So definitely, to go back to the question, yes, Quad is a good point of agreement between Russia and China.
Okay, we have one more question, and then I'll ask a question to wrap up. We can maybe take them together. One is, do you have any recommended books on Russia or China? I suppose like the Sinica podcast or something, we have to do a recommendation category. But of course, you should feel free to highlight your own book as well and let us know where we can purchase that.
Well, I would say that Andrew Small just published a book, so that I don't remember the name yet. It's in my Kindle. I haven't yet started, but certainly that's something worth giving a read. I look at the authors, and there's colleagues whose work I respect. We don't necessarily always agree, but I love their work and I love their method. So I rather can give you a list of authors, and it's not necessarily books. I'm actually a big fan of reports as well. And I know that with think tank reports, of course, it's a mixed bag. But if those colleagues are, for example, you have Justina Schudlik out of PISM in Warsaw, a colleague that also works on Russia, China. When you have these names, then you know that the research they produce is going to be very good. You have Jakub Jakubowski, who writes on this. So just the list of names is what I go for. And I would also say that Professor Dukalskis has a wonderful book about autocracies in general, which has just been recommended for a prize from what I hear.
Yes, thank you. There was no pressure to plug my book.
We did not rehearse this. This is completely me. Yeah, so just because it's very important to look at this relationship also from a theoretical framing perspective. And of course, this is the question that we often we get it more often than not, the question of whether the autocracy, democracy lens is helpful in looking at the Russia-China relationship or the China's relationship with the West in general. And I would say that not always, but to some extent, if you ask the right questions, then yes, this can be helpful. And that's why I definitely recommend Alex's book on that. But it's wider than just China, of course.
Well, thank you very much.
It's called Making the World Safe for Autocracies?
Dictatorship, yes. So
dictatorship.
The very last question. I'd like to know, based on your research, we know I mean, we can assume safely, I think, that foreign policy makers and elite politicians in China have been watching things unfold for the last 9 months and have presumably drawn some lessons or drawn some conclusions for their own foreign policy or their own situation. People often talk about China potentially, kind of sanctions proofing itself, for example. But after having watched this invasion and the backlash unfold for the last 9 months, what do you think Chinese leaders are thinking, and what kind of conclusions do you think they've drawn with the benefit of this 9 months of hindsight?
Yes, well, first of all, the big question that we've been asked is whether they've applied this to Taiwan in any way, right? Well, I think it's hard not to. It's like don't think about the monkey or what. How does the adage go, right? So of course, I'm sure that it's been debated, and we see how Taiwan has come up. And one big conclusion is that, of course, there's an immediate unity in the West, something that wasn't expected, and that's something that the Chinese would have to reckon with. But I think another thing that comes out of this, and we also see it in the analytical publications, is sort of the give it time mindset. The idea that Western unity can be worn out by patience, and the idea that arguments, and that also the idea that actually the arguments that the West makes do not persuade the global South. So I think those are the major conclusions, but also the idea that this could be China's time for China's strategic rise, and we see that coming up. So against this instability, against the war in Europe, against all that, against this background of the war in Europe, we are the ones that could. That's the idea that's being sold. And by the way, Xi Jinping came up with the Global Security Initiative, right, a couple of months ago. So we still don't know how much, what does that really mean? But we know that anecdotally, people from the region have already attended conferences on global security, on GSI, thinking about how to wrap it. So kind of a Belt and Road with tanks. What's it going to be? We don't know. But that already shows that China's ready to thinking, okay, how can we use this opportunity? How can we step up as a global presence?
Okay, brilliant. I think we will leave it there. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We will have a YouTube recording of this at some point after we're able to upload it. But otherwise, I'd like to thank Dr. Bērziņa-Čerenkova for joining us and really giving us a lot to think about and a lot of insight into this really important relationship. And we hope someday to be able to welcome you in Dublin in person to share your research. But until then, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been an honor.